We really enjoyed last night. David and I both have talked, and it was a very special evening because we really feel that a lot of the labor in sessions 1 through 4 helped lay the groundwork for understanding the priority of the Jewish narrative. So it's been we felt last night was making that turn of the corner almost. And we felt a sense of clarity about some things that were being discussed. But Dave and I want to come and add a little bit more, to things that we want to make sure are very clear, and just add a little bit more direction to a few things. So, David, in terms of your portion last night, really enjoyed that. Ethnicity and election. Man, take us a little bit deeper into a couple familiar passages for many that know their Old Testament, but really a couple interesting examples of the priority of, how gods and land and these things work together, not only for the nations, but of course for Yahweh and Israel.
Yeah. I think one of the reasons why we were highlighting the idea of really pushing the idea of ethnicity, that it doesn't just connect to peoples, but also to the gods that those peoples worship, is that from the ancient world, that's kind of their framework for things. And the reason why that's important is that we kind of miss out on what it means for Abraham, when God calls Abraham to leave his family, his land, all of these things. It's like we miss out on the gravity of what that means for him, and the attachment points to the God of Israel, as the God of Israel is an ethnic God. He's the God, the creator who made everything, but in the story, he's tied himself to Abraham and to Israel. And so that helps inform what's going on for even the Gentiles finding blessing by leaving their gods and joining themselves to Abraham's God, or to the God of Israel, this is we don't get that framework unless we understand these ethnic pictures. And so we looked at some of those categories and we're not going to revisit those here, but for instance, one of the major ones that was built in is that God's peoples and lands are all connected. And so there's real concern over territories and even how that functions for worship, and how to respect a God when you're in their territory, and that kind of thing.
This is that language from Acts 17 you were talking about last night, boundaries, right?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So Yahweh separated out those boundaries for the nations, and he has his own boundary that he chose, his own portion. But one example I just wanted to bring up, I think it kind of illustrates some of this, is in 2 Kings 5. This is probably I remember hearing this story, in Sunday school, and it's probably in my children's Bible sitting on the shelf over there. The story of Naaman, the general, or captain of the army of the king of Aram. So he is this prominent leader among this Gentile nation, but he has leprosy. He has a skin condition. Yeah. And, we're not going to read the story, but the general framework of it is, he's searching out Elijah as the prophet of Israel and is longing to be healed, basically. And it's really interesting because Elisha sent a messenger to him saying, in verse 10, he says, "Go and wash in the Jordan 7 times, and your flesh will be restored to you, and you will be clean." And Naaman, he gets angry about this because, he says, I thought, he'll surely come out to me, stand and call in the name of the Lord his God, and wave his hand over the place and cure the leper. So he's kind of wanting like the dramatic prophet antics, like, Elisha's going to come out and do the charismatic healing, and
even the immediate kind of.
Right. Yeah. And then he goes, he's like going into like his own logic of it. Are not these rivers, the rivers of Damascus and all these other waters, aren't they better than the ones in Israel? Like, why do I have to go to the little dinky Jordan to go wash? And he's angered, enraged by this process that requires for him to be healed, and so eventually they convince him, and so he goes. In 14, he dips 7 times in the Jordan, according to the word of the prophet Elisha, and his flesh was restored like the flesh of a little child, and he was clean. And so it would pick up in verse 15. It says, when he returned to the man of God with all his company, came and stood before him, he said, behold, now I know that there's no God in all the earth but in Israel. So please take a present from your servant now. And he said, as the Lord lives, before whom I stand, I will take nothing. And he urged him to take it, but he refused. And so Naaman said, if not, please let your servant at least be given 2 mules load of earth. For your servant will no longer offer burnt offering, nor will he sacrifice to other gods but the Lord. I mean, it's so crazy, because It's like, hey, all I want is to give me some bags of dirt, And it's like, what is going on with this guy? But the issue is that he's talking about returning to his land, and he wants dirt from the land of Israel to worship Yahweh in his land.
Wow.
And so the lands and gods were connected in these realities. And so it's like, his logic is, if I'm going to worship Yahweh as the God, as my God in all the earth, I'm going to get dirt from Israel and put it out on my lawn and worship Yahweh on his dirt.
I'm heading to Israel, brother. Did you bring some dirt back from Jerusalem?
That would be expensive on the airlines. You have to pay extra for that. But yeah, and he goes on and he talks about may Yahweh pardon. He asks for pardon because it's like he has to. His cultural ties here connects him to the gods that he's worshiping, and he's saying, I have to go there, and when I have to go to the house of Ramon to worship, when my master goes, I have to kind of bow, and may Yahweh pardon me for having to do that as I help my master as he worships our God. But I want to worship the God of Israel. So this is such a crazy example in the Tanakh of a Gentile, devoting himself to the God of Israel, as a personal example, yes. But it shows again that those connections between gods and land, and even it's really instructive for, like, God ordained for this guy to find healing by not just like going and washing in his own river, but he has to come to Israel, and he has to humble his own way of processing it. And even he gets angry about it, but he has to ultimately bend his own knee to the way that God has set this for him. And then he's healed. And that becomes a mechanism that's used over and over, that God uses these processes to humble Gentiles by bringing them to Israel and to his plan and his land and his people and his covenant. And in that place, real, authentic faith and worship can take place. And so, I just think it's a really good example of one of these elements of
we were discussing last night. Yep.
Yeah. So, yeah, and one other one, I don't want to spend much time on it really, but what's interesting, it kind of ties the idea of land and custom together, is in 2 Kings 17. We're kind of moving forward in Israel's history, and this is in light of, after the kingdom has been split between Israel and Judah, and this is after the northern tribes have been exiled out and taken captive by the Assyrian armies, and so they're like no more basically, and Assyria comes and resettles peoples of mixed groups into the places that they conquer, and that was a way that they could kind of keep revolts down,
Right.
And so they settled all these various peoples within the boundaries of Israel in the north, and he gets this report. These guys come to the king of Assyria. It's 2 Kings 17, verse 26. And so, and this really is talking about Samaria, and the origins, we could say, of Samaritans, that, in the first century, we kind of have that framework. But in verse 26, these guys, they come to the king of Assyria and they say, the nations you've carried away into exile in the cities of Samaria, these guys, they do not know the custom of the God of the land, speaking about Yahweh. It's Yahweh's land, but they just call him the God of the land. And he sent lions among them, and they will kill them because they do not know the custom of the God of the land. And so the king of Assyria, he's like, well, let's get some priests to go live there so that they can teach people how to fear Yahweh, the God of the land. And so, let's find some priests among the exiles and who kind of know something about the way, these protocols for respecting this God. And let's send them over there so that they can teach these people so that they don't all die, And so what's interesting here, I mean, and we won't go through the narrative, but what's interesting is that Yahweh has his land, and he also has specific protocols of honoring him or respecting him within his territory, and those things are upheld. And if you don't uphold those, then there can be consequences, really negative consequences for it. And so it's just another example of this. This was, something that was across the ancient world, not just for Israel, but also for various nations and their gods. And so these were elements that people were talking about, trying to understand, and you would want to be respectful to a god in their territory, and even more so for the God of gods, the God of Israel, who is unquestioned in him being above all. And so he has specific parameters for these guys who are mixed company, but even stronger parameters as we move into the covenant with Israel and them dwelling in his land that he has promised to give them, but there's like very specific stipulations for them to stay in that land. And we'll look at that more as we move into the Sinai.
Yeah, session 6 next Monday. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but I think just understanding some of these elements of
so good
election, the ethnicity in the election really help us grasp where things are with the nations and their gods, and Israel and their God, and what it means for nations to leave their gods and worship the God of Israel as the narrative unfolds. And so, we'll transition into the next little section here that we wanted to talk about together is we're looking at the Abrahamic covenant. And the Abrahamic covenant, there's several covenants in the Hebrew Bible. And so It's one of several, and so a lot of Christians only have paradigms, in some sense of like Old and New Covenant. There's only the Old Covenants in the Old Testament, the New Covenants in the New Testament, and we see it as like only two covenants. But that's just like a misunderstanding of what's going on. Of there's multiple covenants in the Tanakh, and that even there's not a mutual exclusive thing between Old and New, between like Old and New Testament stuff. That's just not very accurate to the story. But the Abrahamic covenant here, there's various types of covenants that are made, and the way that they're made. And so one of the things that David was bringing up and just kind of forecasted a little bit, and I'm going to pitch it to him in a second here and let him kind of talk around this some, but that covenants were made in certain ways. And so a lot of times people try to analyze these covenants, and they're trying to look at the pieces and how do we categorize these covenants, because it can be stuff like this covenant is conditional, it has conditions, but this other covenant is unconditional, it's going to be fulfilled no matter what. Or sometimes people will look at how they function and say it's an administrative type thing or it's a promise. And trying to just kind of categorize in these ways can be helpful, but there's probably arguably a more precise way to try to categorize these covenants in the Hebrew Bible. And so one of the more precise ways would be by their enactment. And so David brought up this idea of bilateral in how they're ratified, how they're made, or unilateral. And so a bilateral is where, there's a king, and then there's lower parties, we would say like vassals, and the king comes and to the vassal, and they both form the commitment and the terms of the covenant and the relationship and all of this. And so, and they both have to agree on them. Both parties are saying, yes, we're agreeing in this framework, and they are ratified from both sides in a bilateral way. And they both swear to the terms together. And so the other hand is the unilateral covenant, where these are the superior alone offers the terms and makes commitments to the terms. And the inferior can choose to enjoy the benefits that are pledged in those terms as long as they associate to the king, the higher figure. And as long as they, maintain their commitment and their fidelity to that king, but their participation is voluntary. They're not like swearing the oath of the commitment there. And so in this case, only the king swears the oath, in a unilateral covenant. And so in these different covenants in the Hebrew Bible, there's Abrahamic is this first example of this like unilateral covenant, right? And there's other examples, but then there's the next covenant that comes along the way with the nation of Israel is it's bilateral in how it's fulfilled. And so, do you want to pick up any of kind of the conversation? I know we're not going to get into all of this stuff about how ancient Near Eastern covenants are made and stuff, but it helps us understand what's going on a little bit more with Abraham.
Very, very helpful. Yeah, even as David was just mentioning in last night, as you remember in Genesis 15, God, Yahweh is the one that's making covenant with Abraham. He's the one that, there's this division, this cutting of the covenant. It's these animals cut in two, and God walks through these split halves of animals where there's blood everywhere. And as we mentioned last night, the interesting thing is Abraham is asleep. So we see it as a, quote, a unilateral covenant. The superior is making the covenant, and he's the one going to carry that out. Now, what is that unilateral covenant? And last night specifically, we talked about the fact that God's going to make a great nation through this one man. It'll be inclusive of descendants and land. Those were the big pieces that we were dealing with last night. Another picture of the unilateral covenant would be the Davidic covenant. This is like Second Samuel 7, where God says, there will be a man that will sit on your throne, David, King David. There'll be a man who will sit on your throne forever. And I think it's interesting. I'll just allude to this just for a second. Is Luke chapter 1. We find like a little more clarity on what that actually looks like, because we understand that that one that will sit on the throne of David forever is Messiah Jesus himself. Luke 1, verse 31, the angel Gabriel speaking to Mary, and behold, you will conceive in your womb and bear a son, and you will name him Jesus. He will be great, will be called the Son of the Most High, and the Lord God will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever, and his kingdom will have no end. So this is a covenant God's making with David, but it is God making the covenant. And of course, its ultimate fulfillment is that Messiah Jesus will sit on that throne, not in this age, but in the kingdom committed to Israel in the age to come. So these two, Abrahamic and the Davidic covenants, are unilateral. When we get to what's known as the Mosaic covenant, we turn to this, what David just discussed, this bilateral. And the bilateral, again, is God initiates the covenant, but there is a response. And in this Mosaic covenant at Sinai, now we're talking about Exodus 19 and 20. Not going to go into great detail here, because David and I are going to pick this up a lot more in detail in session 6 coming up next Monday evening. But this is the bilateral covenant is an agreement between Yahweh and Israel as a nation. The distinction between God making a covenant to Abraham and David unilaterally, this bilateral covenant now, it's Yahweh making a covenant with the nation of Israel. And when you read through those accounts in Exodus, you see Israel as a nation are agreeing yes and amen, and they are coming into agreement. So this bilateral covenant is, there's conditions, and there's on the basis of obedience that will either lead to blessing, or disobedience will lead to curses. And God set this before Israel big time. The interesting thing too, and I would encourage us, this is going to push probably against popular opinion, but and not going to go into great detail, but just want to mention the fact that this, what we would call the Old Covenant, it's the Mosaic covenant. It's this bilateral covenant between Yahweh and Israel as a nation. When you pick up the language in passages like Jeremiah 31, Ezekiel 36, Hebrews 8 through 10, there's this understanding of the new covenant. Now, most of us have been trained that we're in the new covenant today. We would beg to differ because of study over the last years, that the new covenant is actually, according to Jeremiah 31 and many other passages, that the new covenant is going to be made not with not Yahweh with with Israel as a nation at Sinai, but it will be with Messiah Jesus will make the new covenant, and he will inaugurate that new covenant with the nation of Israel in the promised land, not at Sinai, and it will be with those who have come through and survived great tribulation, what's known as Jacob's trouble at the end of this age. Jesus will make covenant, this new covenant with Israel. And the beauty of that with national Israel, it will include the complete removal of sins, the writing of the law of God upon their hearts, and the giving of the Holy Spirit. And as well, they will love God wholeheartedly. It's really a fascinating thing that we will look at probably in sessions going forward in the future. But this just gives us an understanding that the bilateral covenant between Yahweh and Israel is one. In Exodus, it's at Sinai, but in the age to come, the new covenant will be made between Yahweh, Messiah Jesus, and national Israel. So as you see that unfold, it's really beautiful. Even the fact that, just in a very simple way, Jeremiah 31 is very clear that this covenant is for Israel and Judah. So anyway, I hope that's helpful a little bit, just to get a little background on the distinction between unilateral, bilateral. David, any follow-up on that?
Yeah, I think it's categorizing them in this way is helpful because because all covenants have conditions. Yes. I mean, all covenants are defining relationships, and those always have, obligations involved.
Think about marriage,
Yeah, totally. And so it doesn't, to say that it has conditions doesn't mean anything negative, and helping to understand it in this way of how it's ratified, it gives more precision in what's going on, because even with Abraham, there's conditions. I mean, he says, go forth from your land. Like, he actually has to go. He actually has to leave, yes. And then later what happens with, for him to participate in these covenant promises, he has to follow the rite of circumcision, that what God says. So there are like conditions that are attached to it, but it's the fact that the superior, unilaterally says, I am making this oath, and I'm gonna be the one who maintains and fulfills this thing, So it's just helpful, to have those categories for moving forward.
Well, David, we'll journey on just a little bit further, pick up the Abrahamic covenant now, moving out of some of this other background. And we want to look at the eternality of the land, or what's known as the everlasting possession. I want to read from Genesis 17 and just pick up a couple verses. This covenant that's being made with Abram, and the changing of his name to Abraham in Genesis 17. Remember now, Abraham's been waiting on the promise for 25 years. He's 99. Sarah is 90. She's barren. And Abraham is beyond the years to be able to produce. And we get to Genesis 17, verse 6. God says, I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come forth from you, Abraham. I will establish my covenant between me and you, your descendants after you, throughout all generations, for an everlasting covenant, to be God to you and to your descendants after you. Verse 8, and I will give to you and to your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land from Canaan, for an everlasting possession, and I will be their God. So we begin to see here this land promise to Abraham is not temporary. It is not even to be understood as being fulfilled in this age. Ultimately, this is an everlasting covenant. It's an everlasting possession where Yahweh says that land is mine, and that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob will dwell on that land, which, as we discussed last night, according to several passages, it gives us an understanding that there is the necessity of resurrection, that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob will be resurrected from the dead and be able to actually live on that land. A couple other passages that highlight this would be like Psalm 105. I'll just read a couple verses from there. Psalm 105 is also found in 1 Chronicles 16. But let me just read these few verses. Psalm 105, beginning in verse 8. Yahweh has remembered his covenant forever, the word which he commanded to 1,000 generations, the covenant which he made with Abraham, and his oath to Isaac, and then he confirmed it to Jacob for a statute, to Israel as an everlasting covenant, saying to you, I will give the land of Canaan as the portion of your inheritance. So we see that this land is, it's an everlasting possession. It's promised to Abraham and his descendants. And again, it is just a fascinating thing that for Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the patriarchs from the book of Genesis, that it necessitates resurrection for them to actually dwell on that land. And when you play that thing out, it makes you kind of stand in awe and wonder to recognize that there is real resurrection of bodies where we will be there with them and actually be able to see Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. That ought to just messes us up, you know. So let's get over also to Hebrews 11, and really, actually, I'm gonna go ahead and pitch this over to David, because just a little more background on this piece in terms of everlasting possession and the fact that there's a future realization or fulfillment of this actual land covenant to Abraham. David, if you'll take that.
Yeah, I just think that it's important for us, here Genesis sets the precedent. We have to allow the Bible to, what's said in the beginning, it controls the narrative moving forward. And, I think that these kind of things that God, he swears to Abraham, he commits these oaths that are just so massive in their implication. And then just to think that, all that's just kind of been changed around, or, whatever, as we move forward in the future, maybe that all of those promises are kind of spiritualized or realized in different ways. It really treats that thing so lightly as the narrative it basically creates a different story somewhere along the way. And so, just thinking about this, a Jewish narrative versus a Gentile narrative moving forward into the future, I think this Jewish narrative has the covenant with Abraham and the everlasting possession of the land, Yahweh saying, I'm going to be your God. All these other guys, they're the gods of the nations, but I'm going to be your God, to be God to you and to your descendants, But if it doesn't have, I guess what I'm saying is the Jewish narrative has this future of the land of Israel, a real dirt boundaries, territories in the Middle East. You can go there today and see it, and stand on it. It's earthy, versus some kind of immaterial thing, some kind of heavenly. Maybe God was actually talking about Abraham inheriting heaven, or the earth, them dwelling on the earth for an everlasting possession doesn't matter. And so that even affects views about resurrection of the dead. Yes. If they don't raise from the dead and live on the earth in the Middle East, then the covenant's not actually like fulfilled the way that God said.
Yes.
You know? And there's going to be an ongoing distinction of the sons of Abraham as a people. The ethnicity continues on. Like there is no, like in the age to come, it's not going to be this like totally flattened out and everybody's just like all the same ethnic like group. It's going to be this ongoing Jew and Gentile even into the age to come. Yes. That those distinctions continue because they're part of God's plan. He uses the diversity as a way to express like something beautiful, even in the age to come in the restoration. And so, Gentile narratives take some of Abraham's promises here and they spiritualize them into something heavenly. Doesn't require real land, doesn't require real resurrection, and doesn't require Israel as his people, as Abraham's lineage and people, actually forever inheriting these things. And so, that's where stories get changed around as opposed to them continuing on in the future the way that they've been committed in the covenants. And so I think it's important for us to understand the Jewish narrative from this perspective. And then even Hebrews 11, I don't know if you were going to go there, but even in Hebrews 11, it says that all these people of faith, right, and Abraham and Isaac, but kind of the summary statement at the end is that all these, in verse 39, having gained approval through their faith, they didn't receive what was promised. They still, did not walk in the full inheritance of what God committed to them. And so either he's going to actually do it the way he said, or he is not reliable in his promises. And so the whole framework is faith and trust, even unto death, even going to the grave, knowing that God is going to fulfill what he said, and that's what all these examples of faith, God's going to raise me from the dead and give me the land inheritance, just like he said,
Pointing to a future inheritance.
Yeah.
A future hope.
Yeah.
The only other option, David, it would be that we reimagine or reinterpret those things when we get to the New Testament.
Right.
And we know that this is where we're going to begin to push against, to keep the Jewish narrative, to maintain that all the way through the New Testament, all the way to eschatology, into the age to come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And that's the only way that we can really read our Bibles and it be seamless. Yeah. If we keep the Jewish narrative and maintain it all the way through from Genesis 12 all the way through to the age to come.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Wow. David, I love the way you even the way you said, it was a strong statement just a moment ago, but you said that it's the Jewish narrative that controls, this thing going forward. And if it doesn't, if we lose the Jewish narrative, we'll go off into la la land somewhere, and begin to just allegorize and spiritualize so many things. Yeah. Rather than keep them real and earthy and what God intended, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think starting out, just interpreting our Bible in this way and reading, it's like, okay, these are the promises. Okay, so if it isn't this, where was it changed around? So we just read forward, and as the things are revealed, you just say, okay, that this is the way God has set. It controls the narrative, and unless something else totally shifts that around, this is the narrative. And a lot of times, when you read from the right side of your Bible and just kind of go back to the left here and there, it can kind of, there's all these different stories and interpretations, and it's like, well, that was changed around here. And it's like, well, where was it changed around? Where was it reimagined and redefined? And, and a lot of times you can't actually identify where it was because it wasn't. And so it just helps, us to rightly interpret as we read the scriptures,
So good, Dane. Thank you, brother. Well, David, I do think we need to just let's press on just a couple more minutes.
Yeah.
Genesis 17, we looked at the everlasting possession, verses 7 and 8, and the everlasting covenant. And then you come down in Genesis 17, verse 9, God said further to Abraham, now as for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your descendants after you throughout their generations. This is my covenant which I've made with you. You shall keep it between me and you and your descendants after you, and every male among you shall be circumcised, and you shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be the sign of the covenant between me and you. And we come on down, and verse 13, a servant who's born in your house, who's brought up with your money, shall surely be circumcised. Thus shall my covenant be in your flesh for an everlasting covenant. So just a little bit of background on this, David, related to circumcision, the seed, and even carrying this over to Messiah, Jesus.
Yeah, I think, if you do any reading in the ancient Near East on circumcision, it's pretty common. It's not something unique to Israel alone, and other cultures did it, and a lot of times they would do it as like, in significant times of men's lives, like, kind of rites of passage in different periods and stuff. But Israel's here is clearly laid out in verse 14 about, verse, you read it in about the 8th day. Where is it?
I didn't read it actually, but it's in here.
Yeah. So, anyways, we'll pick it up later. But verse 12.
Verse 12. Yeah.
In 8 days old, shall be circumcised, and so, from the beginning is like a child is set apart, a male child is set apart, and really what's interesting is the reproductive organ is the thing that, is part of the sign. And this connects to the idea of the seed, the offspring. And, you can trace that back all the way towards the beginning of Genesis, but it also deals with, Abraham and his offspring. And it's like this kind of painful identification, but there's this element of hope for the seed that's built into kind of the meaning behind this act, and this thing sets them apart as a people, identifiably. It's an ethnic marker and stuff like that. But really, what's kind of interesting is that we don't think as much about how this is such a huge thing for the nation ethnically to identify with this. And it really gets a lot of airtime through Jewish literature and stuff. It's a big deal.
Circumcision.
Yeah. But, and really it is a big deal because it is part of being a member in and participating in the covenant. I mean, you, as a male, this is required, And so it's an obligation. But one thing we were talking about, David and I were talking about the other day, is like, most of us Gentiles don't think about this, but it's like, you could ask the question like this, is your Jesus circumcised? Because if he's not circumcised, then he doesn't connect to the story and he can't help you.
Son of the covenant.
Yeah. And so this is the point in the Gospels of like, in Luke 2, verse 21, it makes the point of when 8 days had passed before his circumcision, he was called Jesus. And so the idea is that he's circumcised on the 8th day and given the name Jesus that the angel that had told Mary before he was conceived in the womb. And so it really does make the point that he is a son of Abraham, and otherwise the story doesn't connect, that it doesn't play out. And so this hope that all the nations can be blessed in Abraham, and through Abraham and his lineage, that thing doesn't connect to the New Testament unless Jesus is a son of Abraham, and so we have to really see those connections between the two. And as the story moves forward, and
so good. Well, David, do we, as we close here today, we'll be maybe just a couple more minutes, we'll be done. Israel as God's hinge and conduit for blessing. We picked that up. Let's just read that again. Genesis 12, 1-3, and then we'll make a couple closing comments related to this. Now, Yahweh said to Abram, go forth from your country, from your relatives, from your father's house, to the land that I will show you. I will make you a great nation. I will bless you. I will make your name great, and so you will be a blessing. Verse 3, I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And we were just thinking about, the reality of how does that thing play out, even, throughout history, as well as to the end of the age. Those who bless Abraham and bless Israel will be blessed. Those who curse will be cursed. And wow, it's very surreal, Dave. And we were talking about this out of Matthew 25. Do you want us to chat about that a little bit, or?
Yeah, we could just highlight the idea. I mean, I think that we're kind of running out of time to get into the passage much, but I think, God makes, here again, the whole framework is the nations are handed over, and God chooses Israel, and then he makes Israel the conduit for blessing. And so all the nations to relate, you have to relate to Israel and her God and her story and the unfolding of this story. And if you relate wrongly and, as cursing, then you will be judged.
Real consequences.
And it's really like, it's built into the histories of Israel and the nations, is that this crazy thing that God chose, because the history of the nations is they want to be the chosen. Mm-hmm. They want to be the center of the story, and they want to be the ones that get all the blessing, mediate the blessing, it's the jockeying for power and all of this stuff, right? But the history of Israel is they want to be the not chosen, so to speak, and they want to be like the nations. They don't want to deal with the stigma of uniqueness and being set apart and all of those, different things that set Israel apart as unique and often end up like generating hardship for them, and the covenant kind of generates that a lot of times through history. And a lot of times it's just because the nations are raging against God's choice.
Yes.
But like that moving forward, like God made it the mechanism where nations have to humble themselves related to his choice for Israel. And that mechanism, you can't bypass that thing. I mean, that's built right into this framework. And so even in Matthew 25, we don't have time to get into it, but it seems like in Matthew 25, in the age to come, it's not a parable. A lot of people will say the parable of the sheep and the goats, but it's actually not a parable. And it's talking about the Son of Man coming. And
let me just a quick prelude, David. Yeah. So Matthew 24, the Olivet Discourse, what's unfolding at the end of this age, and then it flows. There are a few parables between 24, 25, and then we get to chapter 25, I think verse 31, when the Son of Man comes and sits on his glorious throne. And there's this sheep and goat judgment. And look at the litmus test. Look at what's going on between the sheep and the goats. And so it's connected to this. How did we treat Israel? How was Israel treated in that time? I know we use this as a missional kind of thing, David, but pick that up, man, and carry that forward, and we'll close her down.
Yeah. So the Matthew 25:31, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, then he will sit on his glorious throne, and all the nations will be gathered before him, and he'll separate them from one another as the shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. And so these are the nations being gathered, the Gentiles being gathered before Jesus, the Son of Man. And there's this division, and he talks about those on his right inherit the kingdom of God, right? That's prepared from before the foundation of the world. And then he says, I was hungry, gave me something to eat. I was thirsty. I was a stranger. I was naked. I was sick. I was in prison. And they came and cared for him. And they're like, when did we see this? And he says, to the extent that you did it to one of these brothers of mine, even to the least of them, you did it to me. But then the opposite of those are the ones, he says in verse 41, to those on his left, he says, depart from me, accursed ones. They received this curse.
Genesis 12, verse 3.
Yeah, it seems like it's connecting to what's going on there of into the eternal fire, which has been prepared for the devil and his angels. These go away into eternal punishment, but the righteous into eternal life, this separation between, everlasting condemnation and everlasting life. And so it seems like what's going on here is a lot of times it's interpreted as kind of this, social concern, right? Like care for the poor and all that's good. We really want that to be, that's built into the gospel itself, and that's built into the framework of the Bible of justice for those who don't have and care and all of these things, right? These are good deeds to care for in this age. But here the context, it seems so intense for everlasting judgment for omission of social concern. You know what I mean? It's like
something bigger going on here, huh?
Yeah. And the context here is the end of the age, this Olivet Discourse. And these elements of in 35 through 36 in the passage, these hunger, thirst, all this stuff, I think the interpretation is helpful and pretty convincing, is that these are related to Israel at the end of the age, who will be going through great trouble, according to the covenant.
Yes.
That Yahweh is maintaining his covenant and bringing judgment at the end of the age. But these nations, instead of recognizing that Yahweh is doing this thing, right, and people actually like caring and extending and blessing, those who do the cursing or the omission of it will be held accountable. So it makes Israel this hinge point. They're kind of like the kryptonite in the earth. People have to relate to them rightly, and relating to them rightly actually it coincides with this mechanism that God has intended for humans, for the nations to humble themselves and trust his plan and his choice, as you move forward. And so anything else, David, with that idea? And
yeah, I just remember, probably, I don't know, man, many years ago, I remember you making this statement to me, and I've got it written in my Bible. Standing with Israel is a litmus test for allegiance to Jesus at the end of the age. Very real, man. And so even that Abrahamic covenant, you know, and that initial blessing and curse is driving all the way even to Matthew 25.
Yeah.
So we want to be those who stand with God's people and care for them even in the time of trouble that's coming against that nation at the end of the age. So I know that we've carried some things from Genesis all the way to its eschatological end. There's a lot here, guys, but I think it's really beautiful and fascinating to watch how the scriptures unfold, and that we can take things from Torah and carry it all the way into the New Testament and let the New Testament be informed and instructed out of Torah itself.